Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another video tutorial on JavaScript for beginners. And in this video tutorial, we are going to be taking a basic introduction at animations using JavaScript. So in the previous video tutorial of this playlist, we discussed about the timing functions, that is the set interval, clear interval, set timeout and clear timeout. So if you have missed that video, do check that out because we are going to be using those methods in this video. And that's how we are going to be performing some basic animations of fade in and fade out. So what we are going to be doing is when I click on this fade out button, this image that is being shown over here will slowly fade out and it will create a smooth transition. And when I click fade in, it will come back in a very smooth way in a fade in transition. Okay. So that's the entire purpose of this video and that's what we are going to be doing. So as you can see in the body, you can see we have a button which says fade out, and on click we are calling the fade out function, which we will create in the script tag in the JavaScript. Then we have an image with the ID img1 and I have loaded an image which is in the images folder, and the name of the image is simplesnippets.png, and I've given it a basic width. And lastly we have the third button which is fade in, and on click we are calling fade in, and that function we have to create in JavaScript. So let's get started with the coding of this basic animation, and now we are getting into animations. And again, if you have missed the previous video of the timing functions, do watch that because we are directly going to be using those methods over here. So starting off in the script tag, what I've done is I've created two variables. One is opacity and I've set the value to 0, and the second one is interval ID. So when we are going to be stopping the timer, that is when the animation is done, we have to stop the timer from calling the function over and over again, right? So we are going to be using the interval ID, and this is something that we saw in the previous video. And the opacity variable is what we are going to be manipulating. So this image has an attribute of opacity. Okay, so if you go ahead in the images and if you say style, if you're just performing inline CSS, and if you say opacity colon, and if I say 0.5 or 0.4, you can see the image gets faded out, right? So the opacity value, that is this attribute or this CSS style of this image tag, ranges from 0 to 1. Okay, so if I say 0.1, it will be very faded. You can see you cannot even see it barely. So if you say 0.9, it becomes much more clearer, and if you say 1, it's completely visible. So what we are going to be doing is we are going to be taking this opacity value and we are going to be calling a function over and over again, and every time that function is called, we are going to be reducing this opacity value by some value, that is 0.1. So we are going to be subtracting 0.1 every time for the fade out, and we are going to be adding 0.1 for the fade in. Okay, so you'll understand that when we actually type in the code, but right now that's the reason why I've created this opacity variable. So let's start off with the programming. Let's first create the fade in and fade out functions. So let's start off with fade out. I'm going to say function fade out. Now inside this, I'm going to be calling the set interval function or the set interval method. Now the set interval method requires two parameters. The first one is the function reference. So let's say this is hide, and we have to separately create the hide function also. And I'm going to pass 20 milliseconds over here. Okay. Now when we call this set interval function, it returns us a unique ID of the timer, which is set internally and which schedules this hide function over and over again. So we have to store that ID. So I'm going to store that ID in this interval ID variable that we have created. Okay. So when I click on fade out, that is when I click on this button, the on click event is going to be called and the fade out function will be called. And in the fade out function, we will call the set interval method, which will schedule the timer to call hide method after every 20 milliseconds. Okay, so this is the idea. So we have to also create the hide function. So let's create the hide function. So I'm going to say function hide. So this is where the entire coding of the animation is going to happen. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to access this image tag using the document.getElementById. So I'm going to say var img is equal to document.getElementById. I'm going to pass the ID of the image. The ID of the image is img1. You can see over here. So the next thing is we want to access the opacity of this image, right? So now this is a JavaScript variable image, which is pointing to this HTML element, right? So we can access the properties by using the style tag or the style attribute. So I could have said document.getElementById.style.opacity, right? But opacity is something which is handled differently in different browsers, so we cannot directly use this getElementById. So we have to use another way. So since we have created a opacity variable over here, what we'll do is we'll say opacity is equal to window dot get computed style. We're going to be passing this image object which points to the image attribute, and I'm going to say dot get property value, and inside this I'm gonna say opacity. So this is a workaround to get the opacity value indirectly. We have to use the window object and we have to say get computed style, and we have to pass the object, or we have to pass the HTML element reference of which the opacity is supposed to be wanted, and then we have to say dot get property value, and inside that we have to pass opacity. Okay, so this is something you have to do to fetch the opacity, and this will give us the current opacity. But right now you can see that the image is having opacity as 1 because it is completely visible. So initially when you call the hide the first time, the opacity value is gonna be equal to 1, right? Now this function returns the opacity, but it is in a string format. So to convert this into number, we can use a number constructor function, and we have to wrap this entire code inside this number constructor function. So if you just hover on it, you can see it returns a number, and it is a number constructor function. Okay, so this is how you convert basic string to numbers. You can do some other methods also. There are other methods also in which you can convert a string to a number, but this is something that we are going to be using. And now our opacity value will have a number variable which initially is going to be 1. Okay, so what we have to do is, now we have to check if the opacity value is greater than 0. So I'm going to say if opacity is greater than 0, we have to bring it to 0, right? Because we are going to be performing hide. So when we are performing hide, we want to get the opacity to 0 from 1. So we will say opacity is equal to opacity minus 0.1. So every time this hide function is going to be called after 20 milliseconds, the opacity value is going to be reduced by 0.1. Okay, and once it reaches 0, so in the else part, that is when the opacity is 0, we will stop this, or we will clear this interval, right? So we have to say clear interval, and inside this we have to pass the interval ID. Now we also have to do one thing, that once we reduce the opacity value, we have to set this new opacity to this image also, right? So this is something that we can do directly. We can say image dot style dot opacity equals to this opacity variable. So setting the opacity is straightforward. You can directly do image dot style dot opacity or document dot get element by ID, and then you can say dot style dot opacity and set the new opacity. But to fetch the opacity, you have to use this workaround method, because as I mentioned, opacity values are handled differently in different browsers and different situations. So now let's see if this works. This is our complete hide function, which will be called after every 20 milliseconds because we are doing it via the set interval method, and this will stop only when the opacity value reaches 0. Okay, so let's click on fade out and let's see if this works. And there you go, you can see our code completely worked perfectly fine. Let's actually see it in a little slower way. Let's say 200 milliseconds. So this hide method will now be called after 200 milliseconds and not 20 milliseconds. So the transition will be very slow. Let's click on fade out, and you can see that it is fading out slowly and it is now gone. So if you increase this number, the transition will happen slowly. If you want it to happen smoothly, you give a lower number and then it happens smoothly. So similarly, let's create the code for fade in. So we have to create one more function named fade in, because that's what we are calling over here. So I'm just going to change this fade out to fade in. Again, set the interval ID, and instead of hide, I'm going to say show. Okay, so let's create this show function. So I'm going to say function show. Now the code inside the show is also going to be pretty much similar to this. So I'm just going to copy this entire hide function and paste it inside this show. But the only thing that is going to be changing is, here we are going to be checking for if opacity is less than 1. Because when you are showing or when you are revealing the image, our opacity is already become 0, right? And we have to go from 0 to 1. So instead of going from 1 to 0, we have to go from 0 to 1. And that's why we have to add 0.1 at every iteration. Okay, that's the only change in the show function. And now let's see if the show function works, because we've already called fade in over here. And what fade in does is it sets the interval and sets the timer to call show after every 20 milliseconds. And this will go on and on until the opacity value becomes 1. Once the opacity value becomes 1, we call clear interval, so the function stops calling itself. Okay, so let's see. First we'll do fade out. The image got faded out. Let's see fade in, and there you go, we got our image back. And again, you can change and play around with the timing. This is in milliseconds. If you want slower transitions, you can increase the number. If you want faster, you can reduce the number. And one more thing that you can do is you can also see the opacity values using the console.log. So what we'll do is, let's try to use the console.log function or log method to see the opacity values. So I'm going to use this in show as well as hide over here. And in our browser, click F12 to open the dev tools. We've already seen a dedicated video on what are dev tools and how to use it. So let's click on fade out, and there you go, you can see these values. And once it becomes 0, we call clear interval, right? So no more console values are printed. Let's click on fade in, and there you go, you can see after 0 we got 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 5, 6, 7 till 1. So this is how you can track down the opacity values also using the console. I just wanted to show you can do something like this. And yeah, this was a very basic fade in and fade out animation in pure JavaScript. And you have to write in so much line of code just for this basic animation. So as we move ahead, we'll take a little bit of introduction to jQuery, and you'll see that all this thing can be done in one single line of code, and things get very easy when you use a library like jQuery. So yeah, that's it for this video, guys. This was a very basic animation of fade in and fade out in JavaScript using plain JavaScript code. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, do share it with your friends. Let me know in the comments how this video was, and see you guys in the next video. Peace.